Hello, welcome everybody. It's 5:30, so we will make a start. It's my pleasure today as head of the Division of Communications, Media and Culture to present to you Professor Greg Singh, who will talk to you about even more impressive and serious topic, serious heart problems, how television can rehabilitate our ideas of love, health, and the natural environment. But before I hand the floor to Greg, I do need to say a few things about him. Now, Greg and I joined the division 10 years ago in 2013, in September, I believe, around that time. And that beginning always somehow reminds me of the first episodes of Grey's Anatomy. I'm not sure if you watched that TV show, but we were like those young trainee doctors, full of hope, ambition, determination, excitement, what the future will bring in this brand new world and environment that's going to support us, help us flourish, develop, pursue our career plans. And yes, it did that. Sterling has done that for us. But also there were hard times and there were struggles and there were moments of disillusionment, but something never changed. Throughout this time, we both still loved what we do. And this has brought us to where we are today. Greg is now a professor and he's also Deputy Associate Dean for Interdisciplinary Research, as well as Program Director, again, of digital media programs. He founded them, then he took a break for a while, then we kind of lured him back into it because he was so good at doing it. So we could not just let him go that easily and let you that easily off the hook. So Greg has always been a step ahead of me. I'm an associate professor, but well deserved. At least I get ahead of the division first, which I'm not sure if it's something to brag about.
First?
No. I'm not the first head of the division. I'm not claiming that, just so you know. But I will hand this over to you with pleasure when it's your turn, when you take the baton. But no, it's all really, really well deserved. So that I don't just talk about our 10 years at Sterling. I need to tell you something about what Greg has done in those 10 years at Sterling. So he teaches in the field of media and cultural studies, film studies, and digital media. His teaching and research have always had a really strong emphasis on interdisciplinarity. And in the areas of cultural production and consumption, and recent turn took him into eco-critical studies, and thank you, Greg, for all these complicated expressions. Now this is a real tongue twister here, which include permaculture, the ecology of affordance, waste and reuse, and the Anthropocene, as well as the links between climate change, social technology, and mental health. So it is no wonder, because of the strong interdisciplinarity, that Greg has been appointed as Deputy Associate Dean for Interdisciplinary Research, where he kind of encourages colleagues to work in this interdisciplinary and to work on interdisciplinary projects. I'm going to stop now because, that's been enough of interdisciplinarity. But a lot of this will come through in his lecture today as well. He also got funded research projects in the areas of networks, life and data, as well as waste stories. So really vast interest there and very interesting and very influential areas. Greg has been also very active in publishing. So he published monograph on depth psychology and film theory, Film After Young, Post-Jungian approaches to film theory, and also on emotional work of cinema. So feeling film, affect and authenticity in popular cinema. More recently, he published The Death of Web 2.0, Ethics, Connectivity, and Recognition in the 21st Century. And as I said, some of this will be reflected in his lecture today, which combines film, television, emotions, environment, health. So we've got it all. Without further ado, Professor Greg Singh.
Right then. Thank you, Alenka, for that wonderful introduction. We've worked together for 10 years and we've been sort of really, really close colleagues, and I totally support your work. You're fantastic, and what you do as the head of department is fantastic too. What I've got for you today is a lecture in two parts, really. So the second part of it is going to be this bit, sort of looking at something like that's really sort of occupied my thoughts for the last few months, and it's really a work in progress, but it is a proper sort of research seminar or lecture. The first bit of this, though, is sort of, I hasten to use the word, hesitate, sorry, to use the word journey, but it's sort of like an overview of the last sort of 20 years of my career in real sort of short snapshots, really, to build up a picture of why it is that I'm interested in these particular areas, these areas of television, rehabilitation, natural environment, and so on. Before I get to that, though, some thanks. So thank you so much all for coming today. It's wonderful to see so many of you and some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a while, so it's really good. I'm really chuffed to bits to have you here. Colleagues past and present, young and old. Special shout out to my students. I do have a couple of students here, current students, ex-students. You're the reason that we do this, okay? So anybody who knows that you know, being in the classroom situation is the most fun that you can have in this job, and being a sort of mentor and supervisor to a student is really fulfilling and rewarding. Those moments where the light bulbs go on, if you know, you know, and they are extremely fulfilling part of the work that we do. Friends and non-academic attendees, thanks so much for coming along. So, Hilvy Massive, obviously, big shout out. So I should say, you know, I'm trying to avoid the jargon, okay, but I'm not going to talk down to you. It's going to be an actual proper lecture, okay, but you're going to have both barrels at you, okay, so please bear in mind. But also, the question on your minds, and the answer to that is yes, we do dress like this all the time. Okay, and they do say, you know, dress for your job, and obviously my job is professional Harry Potter cosplayer or something, I don't know, but anyway, it's very rare that we get to wear ceremonial robes like this, so it's kind of, they're really heavy, by the way, and really hot, but it's a really nice thing to do. And last but not least, my family. Love you very much, Janice, Naomi, and Livy, of course. Can't be here at the minute, but she will be here later on. I'm very proud of you and all that you do. And I couldn't do this without you. And literally, quite literally, I couldn't do this without you. I owe the shirt off my back to you, Janice. And that's not a metaphor, right? So here's a story. Okay, so I left the house today, or nearly left the house today, proper mad professor mode, okay, so wearing slippers, carrying my suit without a shirt. So literally I owe the shirt on my back to you, Janet, because otherwise I would have arrived in slippers. Okay, so where does it all begin? Okay, so I grew up in Wales, and I come from a music background. So in my late teens, early 20s, I was in a number of bands, and we had trips to London, in London offices and meetings with industry insiders, industry interest. And of course, you know, this is at a time when there was a music industry to be interested in you. And we nearly made it, but we didn't quite make it, okay? And then after that sort of came to a natural end. I was thinking, well, what do I do with my life? You know, what do I do? You know, what do I like? And it turns out that I like film and television. I thought, right, okay, well, I know what I'll do. I'll write music for film and television. Okay, so being really naive, obviously. So I thought, well, I know about music, but I don't know about film and television. I'm going to go and learn. So I went. I signed up on spec to a film and media degree at a university college in Buckinghamshire. So that should give away where I did my first degree. And it was at an extraordinary time, okay? So at the same time that I did my first degree, the lecturers who were there for the entire time read as a who's who of film and media studies. It's quite extraordinary. So Mark Bald, Anita Baresi, Heather Nunn, Andrew Butler, John Mercer, Greg Tuck, Caro Bainbridge, all of these people were there at the same time while I was there, okay? And during that time, they set a fire underneath me. I just thought, right, okay, I'm quite good at this academic thing. I'm more interested now in film and television than I ever was. And I'm starting to get to know really how these things work and how ideas work and how they inform our understanding of film and television. So really, that's kind of where it starts. Now, I'm going to refer to the script. Okay, I never script things, but I'm going to have to script things for this evening. Otherwise, we'll be here till 8:30. But I've timed it, and it's exactly 53 minutes, including that preamble. But I'm quite nervous, so I might come in at 28 minutes. Okay, just bear in mind, please. Okay, so first of all, as Alenka mentioned, I've written a number of books. So Film After Jung was the first book-length study to synthesize screen theory with theories in Jungian depth psychology in what I thought at the time was a systematic way. It essentially reappraised Jung's theories, the theories of Carl Jung, the psychologist, for understanding the relationship between viewer and viewed in contemporary cinematic texts. And this followed on from many scholars who were working in that field at the time, including our very own Emeritus Professor John Izod, who's a massive influence on my career and my work. At the same time, unbelievably, and please don't do this if you're ever thinking about it or you have kids who are thinking about it, at the same time as writing that, I wrote my PhD thesis on a different topic. I don't know what I was thinking. It was a really intense period, okay? But my PhD was on how cinematic stories have an afterlife. So culturally in the way we talk and write about film, psychologically in the ways that we feel about them, and technologically in the abundance of ways in which film and film culture more generally are accessed and engaged with in increasingly complex ways. And out of that doctoral research, I based my next book. So it wasn't completely wasted. I got a PhD and I got a book out of it. So Feeling Film considered the narrative work of cinema to be beyond the duration of screen time, a re-engagement of the place of emotion, affect and feeling in film theory and criticism, and the usefulness of the concept of cinephilia, or the love of cinema, and our understanding of that sense of feeling. And this eventually led to the last book that I published. So I kind of moved away from cinema and more towards the technological aspects of my thinking. So The Death of Web 2.0, published in 2019, took a sidestep into contemporary communication practices, particularly involving social technologies. And in that book, I sought to understand the outcomes of living in a state of persistent, semi-permanent connectivity. I argued that social media is a kind of false self system, and that ultimately, if we were to rely on social media exclusively, it can only ever produce a diminished and impoverished sense of self and reduced expectations of others as we perceive them. This has a knock-on effect in terms of our sense of mutuality and a sense of true empathic connection with others, which are increasingly challenging to hang on to. My interest in ethics in this regard extended into the ethics of information more generally and ethics of the communication in free-flowing information networks. And this interest led directly to the development of the Data Common Scotland project. Or to give it its full title, Participatory Design and Open Data Platforms for a Data Commons in Scotland. Case study, waste management. Okay, riveting, right? But this was a highly unusual interdisciplinary project in that it was as much knowledge exchange and stakeholder engagement as it was about research. And we drew from expertise from 3 universities in a number of fields. So in communications, education, human-computer interaction design, geographical sciences, data science, and business analytics, as well as several partners from third and public sectors. And our task here was to create a set of design principles for learnable platforms that could enable people from an array of backgrounds, from novice to expert, to utilize openly available data in ways that were practical and actionable. And we alighted on the case study in waste management because this was one area where local authorities have been making a lot of headway in relation to collecting and using data to improve services, but also was an area that was highly visible to the public. So what colour bins do we put out this week? And there was literally that got us thinking, actually, waste management might be a really good way of tackling this problem of open data. So open data is basically information that anyone can access, use and share, subject to a few measures such as preserving provenance and openness. However, we discovered a number of challenges associated with this, chief among them the difficulties there are in establishing standards for open data and its infrastructure. So what we did, and this is just a list, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it just lets you know that we did have a number of academic outputs, and I should give a full acknowledgement and a shout out to our research associates on that project, Hannah Hamilton and Ash McClenaghan, who put in so much work, and of course my colleagues, including Anna Wilson, who's now based at Glasgow, who really helped steer the project, and we wouldn't have gotten anywhere without her expertise. So not only did we produce these academic outputs, we also produce practical and technical ones too. A number of technology-based outputs held in online repositories that are freely available to use by anyone. This case study in waste management included incorporating data in a number of related areas: environment, geographic, household waste, recycling, reuse, carbon accounting, and circular economy. And really, as we'll see, this was the start of my growing interest in an awareness of representations of ecology and environmental humanities more generally. And these have occupied my thoughts quite a lot recently. So my current and future work. So this project led on directly to my work in Waste Stories, part of a Leverhulme Trust research project, which is led by Anna Wilson from Glasgow. I also work alongside colleagues in psychology and social work in setting up a number of knowledge exchange workshops for the Hydro Nation Chair. I've recently put together with a number of colleagues, some of whom are probably in this room actually, I can see at least two, for a UKRI Cross-Research Council responsive mode application. We're still waiting to hear back. Hopefully we'll hear back in the next couple of weeks whether that's successful or not. But that piece of work is around working with schools and with other organisations in Clackmannanshire in particular, looking at placemaking and looking at joining up education, environment and eco-social visions of the future. Really exciting kind of stuff. Well, I find it exciting anyway. I'm also co-PI of the Speculative Futures Lab, which is a group of researchers who come together from across the university, and I lead that alongside Melanie Lovat in social sciences. And finally, the next thing that it's sort of like a mythical beast, this one, right? I've been working on it for quite some time, and I was saved by Charlie Brooker himself, who released the next series this year. So it's still relevant. It's still very much kind of something that's on my mind, and I'm writing this in various stages, and that's a research monograph on Black Mirror. Which is due next year, so I better finish it. Okay, so I'm going to take you back again, right? So we're going to start from the beginning, right from the beginning this time, okay? Does anybody know what that is? Anybody recognise it? Somebody does. Any thoughts? Didn't think this was going to be participatory, did you? But
the superstores, what number?
Who said that? The voice from yes, Saturday Superstores. Yes. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. Thank you very much. 018118055. Right. Yes, exactly. Oh my word. Right. So this was an iconic phone number. Okay, now why am I bringing this up? So this represents several years of Saturday morning television for millions of viewers across the UK in the 70s and 80s. It embodied liveness and, for me, a magical gateway to influencing the outcome of what appears on the screen. This was a first foray into interactivity and connected viewing. It represented the degree of agency and control that diverged markedly from the passivity that characterized predominant viewing positions at the time. And it marks my initial fascination with TV as a medium. Greggy, that big, right? And I'm kind of like, 018118055. I know it off by heart, right? So it was built into the architecture of the studio of BBC shows such as Multicoat Swap Shop from 1976 to 82 and Saturday Superstore from 1982 to 1987. And this sculpted figure of this number drew me in, a clear marker of intentionality from the broadcast end as an emotive and conceptual pull towards the screen. It literally drew me in. I found it fascinating, right? It's worth noting that these numbers stood at the front of other layers of playful engagement with the programs involved. an almost constant direct address to camera and thus to the implied viewer. It heavily influenced liveness and spontaneity in encouraging viewers to phone in to swap toys, tell stories, or talk to celebrities. The performative dimension, highlighting the technology and the modernity of the show, was certainly part of the excitement. So phones in the studio, on-screen graphic captions saying line 1 and so on. We didn't need to know which line it was, but we had that information anyway, right? Celebrity figures stationed at a desk with a phone in hand, or even better on the couch with Noel or Sarah, talking into a cordless brick with an expectant adolescent viewer interacting at the other end. In those days, of course, completely live and without the standard 15-second delays that we have now. So awkward questions for the then PM Margaret Thatcher. Descendants of this foregrounded interactivity can be found in varied examples such as What's Your Story? From 1988 to 1990, a choose-your-own-adventure style show presented by Sylvester McCoy that interlaced liveness from the presenter directly addressing the viewer and banks of telephone operators in the studio taking calls. The conceit of the show was that kids would phone in their ideas for a story, and these ideas were compiled by a team of writers, and the presentation of a drama segment comprised of the best ideas would be played out by actors the next day. Perhaps better remembered, another 80s kids' favourite, Nightmare, running from 1987 to 1994, was a game show variant on the choose-your-own-adventure theme. It took the fantasy role-play, tabletop gaming aspects of Dungeons & Dragons and let contestants explore a CGI fantasy world. A little later, Cyberzone, presented by Craig Charles, featured early VR and haptic interfaces where game show contestants navigated a virtual world set in a sort of techno-dystopian nightmarish future. In that example, simulation of data streams and weird cyberpunk cultural references brought the science fiction and technoculture themes to the fore. It's also notable for the origin of John Fashionu's Awooga catchphrase that he used on Gladiators. He actually plagiarized that from Craig Charles. So you heard that first. Such plays on interactivity in broadcast television and the popular cultural landscape of the UK in the 1980s always, it seems to me, had in common aspects of what we would now describe as connected viewing, albeit in quite embryonic context. However, perhaps in the end, the idea of a truly interactive and connected viewing practice is illusory, a futile argument where the mechanics of choice and the perceptions of agency and free will are contained. And here we have our first jargon alert. As the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze said in his essay, Having an Idea in Cinema, a control is not a discipline. In making freeways, for example, you don't enclose people, but instead multiply the means of control. I'm not saying that this is the freeway's exclusive purpose, but that people can drive infinitely and freely without being at all confined, yet while still being perfectly controlled. This is our future. What he's saying here essentially is something that we can apply to our contemporary broadcast, streaming, and communications ecology. That choice is freely given, yet we do not get to decide our own conditions of choosing. And those conditions are essentially one of immersion in a superconnected world, a world where one's availability and one's ability to engage in instantaneous feedback to demands on our time, energy, and resources is fundamentally the absence of solitude that comes with living in a world of persistent, semi-permanent connectivity. And it means that the space for self-reflection, an essential grounding component for the virtuous circle of conversation, meaningful engagement, introspection, and empathy, is often missing. At the very least, it exists in an impoverished form. The same self-reflection that we find wanting in always-on connectivity turns out to be a requirement for consistency of identity to build relationships in everyday life. And that's a direct quote from my last book. We are, in essence, required to be everything, everywhere, all at once, a literalization of the tropes explored by the award-winning Daniels film of the same name, starring Michelle Yeoh. And it's just as the pressures for Yeoh's character to keep going are intrinsically damaging to her body, her sanity, and her integrity, so it turns out that this is a desperately bad thing for human beings in the real world too. So how do we address this issue? Turn off the machines? Well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. The worlds of work, of finance, of economics all depend on connected technologies. At an everyday level, On a cashless campus, one has no choice but to tag along with electronic transactions. Increasingly, employers look to social media footprints to assess suitability of candidates for employment. Is this person of good character? What are their socials like? Sure, one can be a refusenik and can make a virtue out of abstention from social media and smart technologies. And people are starting to make tentative steps to address these issues for their own well-being, but it's really difficult to switch off. Carl Norrie wrote a bestseller on this very issue, In Praise of Slow, a book that came out nearly 20 years ago now. So there certainly isn't a new idea. In fact, this book takes a look at the slow movement in detail, going right the way back to the 1980s and the protests against fast food in Italy. What started here developed into a global phenomenon. So we can think about slow food. We get more pleasure and health from our food if we cultivate, cook, and consume at a reasonable pace. Slow cities. Town authorities rethinking how to organise the urban landscape, traffic controls, urban green spaces, recreational spaces to meet and connect with others. Slow health, complementary holistic medical treatments alongside cutting-edge medical technologies, and slow work, with the notable exception actually of North America and the UK. Many countries' working hours are decreasing, and research shows that shorter working hours lead to increases in hourly productivity, feelings of well-being, and self-reported improved quality of life. Who would have thought it? Looking across all of these, one can see the connections between food, space, and health and work are fundamental to the notion of living a good life. And I'm minded here to relay some fundamental findings from research into these areas that have had a profound effect on the way I see the future as being one that, far from speeding up, ought to perhaps be slow. So much of the focus of research funding recently has been directed towards research that looks at these key issues specifically, the relations between how we live, how we work, eat, play, and so forth, and the kinds of spaces we inhabit and share. And these have been central to a number of studies that have fundamentally changed the way I think about this. And I just want to dwell on these for a moment. So in a recent talk given here by Catherine Ward-Thompson, who's a professor of landscape architecture based in Edinburgh, she highlighted a number of eye-opening findings across several studies stretching decades. We've known for a very long time now that access to green and blue spaces, whether man-made or natural, does us literally the world of good. The Victorians knew this, as did the Georgians before them, in creating green restorative spaces in cities through public works. But the work of Ward-Thompson and others goes much further than that. Through the examination of the historical record of urban green spaces and through longitudinal studies, they've confirmed the additive benefits of green space access over the life course, that is to say, from cradle to grave. They make an explicit link between access to green spaces in childhood and healthy cognitive aging. Access in childhood tends to soften cognitive decline in old age. And we know that children in deprived areas and from poorer backgrounds tend to have less access, which has a contributing effect of greater, earlier, and more rapid cognitive decline in people from those backgrounds in later life. Which itself may come as no surprise, but it's still staggering that poverty has such a profound and lasting effect throughout the life course. But it's even more fundamental than that. Not only is getting out and about good physical activity, it can be done as a shared social activity to connect and reconnect with others, or as a restorative act of solitude. That is, of course, solitude, not loneliness, which is a very different thing. It can act as a way of restoring attention, a remedy for the intense directed attention, the constant states of alert, typical of urban environments, constant connectivity, and a working week patterns, and a respite from the allostatic load of everyday life, the condition of intense, persistent stress that so many of us feel. Perhaps more far-reaching, but outside of the scope of this talk and outside of my expertise, I have to say. But in addition to the health, socioeconomics and the psychology of restorative spaces, Ward-Thompson's interdisciplinary research brings in neuropsychology and biological sciences too. So parasympathetic nerve activities that act in physiological and affective response to this allostatic load can be dangerous if overactive, and green spaces can really help with that. There are also even microbiome aspects around access to natural environment, involving autoimmune response benefits where the human body and the environment align at a microscopic level. But all of that, of course, is out there, okay? And I'm interested in spaces and processes where the out there can effectively be brought in here. After all, I am a media scholar, right? So I'm really interested in the media discourse around this and the representations around this. And one way that this has happened is in the subgenre of slow TV. So slow TV, or Satka TV to give its original designation in Norway, is a genre of television that originated in Norway's public service broadcasting. But it has since translated to major streaming platforms such as Netflix and has parallels in the Korean-originated YouTube genre of mukbang. I'm also told, although I've not managed to track any examples of this down yet, but I will do at some point, there is a version of slow TV broadcast in China, but from the accounts that I've heard, this is a very different thing indeed, in rhythm and in its feel. As explained in a feature on the genre in Scandinavia Standard, the concept of slow TV is to show something at the rate it is experienced, as opposed to the speed with which a narrative drama is told. There is no editing or script. It's built around transition and movement instead of tension and plot. It goes beyond definitions of naturalism, which still condenses human experience into bite-sized pieces. It is the portrayal of often mundane experiences in real time, like a train journey or knitting, as a human would experience it. So quite literally, you can watch a log burning in the hearth for 7 hours, or experience views afforded through a real-time train journey between Bergen and Oslo. If you fancy a boat trip along the fjords in Norway, you can do that. It's no problem. And if you ever wondered what it was like to follow a reindeer around for a few days in the snow, you could do that too. Although, incidentally, that last example, they had to cancel it because it was too slow for slow TV, which I think is a really interesting fact. Right, so we do have versions of this in the UK, okay? But they look a little bit different, and they feel a little bit different as well. And we might summarize this as a kind of landscape heritage TV that came into being in parallel with the popularization of high-definition television in the early 2000s, which afforded a certain way of making and viewing television, sweeping vistas, orchestral scores, and crisp high-resolution cinematography. So programs such as A Picture of Britain, Britain's Favourite View, The Great British Village Show, an ongoing series such as Coast, and of course the 3 series of Planet Earth are all typical of the genre. One such show, Wainwright Walks, based on Alfred Wainwright's 7-volume pictorial guide to the Lakeland Fells, follows presenter Julia Bradbury in mountain warehouse gear as she explores the Lake District. The background of this slide that's currently showing shows a really typical composition. Bradbury situated to one side, and we're always positioned behind her, sharing her view of the middle distance, an impossibly breathtaking snapshot of the English countryside. Here putting her reading to one side and taking in the view. Typically saying something as if alone, but of course, if she was really alone, she wouldn't probably be saying anything at all, right? So as the television scholar Helen Wheatley puts it, whilst Bradbury's solitude is of course an illusion, the presence of the crew denied by her dialogue, the following repeated sequence of her sitting as a solitary figure in the landscape tracks off into another appreciative view of the distant hills and is accompanied by a quiet crescendo of strings and piano. And Wheatley discusses several programs as part of a trend that mix heritage, travelogue, other lifestyle and factual elements. And it all looks very pretty, of course, but it's far from wild in any sense of the word. It's kind of kitsch, pedestrian, academicized appreciation that constitutes safe television, never really breaking new ground visually, nor sonically, nor texturally. And all this that television has to offer, I mean, surely there's more that television has to offer to our understanding of slowness, of slowing down. So what is slowness? What does this slowness do? What is its purpose? How can it function? Can we say that there is a sense of slow intentionality at work in television? How is slowness experienced? How is slowness represented? To begin to address these questions, jargon alert number 2, we need to turn to theory for a moment to get our frames of reference necessary to understand slowness in its fullest capacity. So for this, I'd like to turn to Marco Cracchiolo and his definition of slowness. And he says that slowness reveals that multiple strands of affect and sensation coexist within the seemingly bounded now. This plurality is a direct equivalent of what I call the texture of slow narrative, which reflects both the complexity of textual strategies and the thickening of attention. So what does he mean by that? Well, the seemingly bounded now, our experience of time as it happens, is limited to a now that seems contained in the present. But it isn't really. It's filled with memories, sensations, experiences of the past, and with them come a whole range of emotions and feelings, which are there, even if we don't immediately become aware of them. And within each moment is the potential of the future, bounded only by how far our imagination can take us. It's therefore far from bounded. The now is actually boundless in this regard. And in terms of the texture of narrative, he's talking about the fabric of the story, quite literally, how we can make sense of meaning of the world. And not just in a linear sense of, say, a sentence unfolding. We do so again in the sense of feelings, emotions, and in the physicality of being a body, of being in the world, in other words. So what he's saying is that slow narrative has the intention of slowness, and it shows us its slowness through a variety of means: visual composition, pace and rhythm, sound, and in doing so allows us an awareness of a connection with and a thickening of attention towards that boundless now. In order to examine this, I'd like to now turn towards my case study, a case study in what I'd like to describe not as slow TV, but in order to distinguish it, slow television. Thought you might like that. Okay, Mortimer and Whitehouse Gone Fishing. This program is a love story, primarily about love itself. It's expressed between two men, old friends and comedy performers Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse, whose reason to get up in the morning is to make other people in this program, each other, laugh. It's also a love story dedicated to the outdoors, and not just to the pastime of fishing, but also to the love of landscape and to its call to adventure. Not just love expressed by the human participants of the program, but also frequently expressed throughout the series in its formal textual makeup. One of the first things that strikes the viewer when watching Gone Fishing is how gentle it is. It's an example of non-scripted reality TV using documentary modes of representation. It borrows from naturalist photographic and cinematographic techniques and aesthetics. It features two well-known television personalities, white men in their middle age, to whom one is compelled by virtue of their longevity in British popular culture to address by their first names, Bob and Paul, as if old and familiar friends. And this familiarity is, I argue, a crucial element in the programme's success, because the warmth of long-standing friendship is already evident and established before the viewer comes to the programme. So the premise of Gone Fishing is simple. Bob and Paul go fishing in a different location every week and fish for a specific species. Paul is the seasoned fisherman while Bob is the novice. Conversely, Bob organises their accommodation every week and cooks for the pair, often teaching Paul how to prepare heart-healthy food. And in a sense, that is it. On scanning the series, nothing really happens. And perhaps because of the programme's simplicity, it reveals nuggets of honest and stripped-bare detail about the men and their relationship. The usefulness of this programme in locating, revealing, and engaging with the intertwined and entangled representations of masculinity, of love, the natural environment in slow television can be found in the show's origins, I argue, where the life-threatening heart problems experienced by the two men brought them closer together in mutual support. Would you like to see a short clip? Okay, let's see the opening title sequence from season 2.
Here we are, Bob. Fish it again. Oh, there's a fish there. We'll catch it then.
Well, we both found out that we had quite serious heart problems. I had 3 stents fitted.
I had a triple heart bypass. It's not been for 6, to be honest. Push through the heels, go on. I can't move. He's an old friend. Good lad.
And I thought we probably need to help his hand to get back into the world.
I knew you were going to be doing that. So yeah, Mr. Whitehouse very kindly said, come fishing with me. Yeah. Is it? Am I? Well, what lads at me? Lads with me. I'll be taking care of accommodation. I'm staying in a bus. And cooking you lots of heart-healthy food.
Good to be alive, isn't it, Bob?
Oh, right, a tray box. There's a tray there. You're fitting with a buffoon, aren't you? Yeah. Say hi and wet.
And away. I very nearly called this lecture "And Away," but I think it would have been a little bit too obscure for most people. Okay. So where are we? We are here. Okay. So, so the opening credit sequence establishes the reasons for the program's existence, but also provides a strong signification of Bob and Paul's relationship, in both in kind and in depth. And I include the dialogue here from season 1 for full reference. And note serious heart problems, which is the phrase that I kind of used to title this lecture, and the piece that I'm working on currently. But also that phrase, getting back into the world, which I think is really telling. So one can observe the warmth between the two in this series and the ease in which they joke at the other's expense, whilst at the same time acknowledging the seriousness of their situation. Although this notion of getting back into the world can be taken in a very literal, embodied and simplistic way, at the same time it's much more complex both emotionally and existentially than Paul's casual delivery suggests. In a very real way, both men are faced with their own impending mortality, as well as the possibility of losing an old friend. One gets the sense that Paul is not only aware of the importance of what he's saying, but also of its complexity and its heartfelt implications. And I would like to explore this complexity through two related concepts, if I may. The concept of heart health, to which Bob and Paul often refer, particularly in the earlier seasons of Gone Fishing, is a loaded phrase. It may be taken in the literal health and well-being sense, but also in the emotional sense of care and love. Indeed, the concept of heart health is closely related to that of rehabilitation, a notion implied in Paul's suggestion that Bob needed a helping hand to get back into the world. Now, rehabilitation in its everyday use is a rather loaded term again, often used in the criminal justice system, for example, to determine the effectiveness of programs that those on criminal license are required to complete in order to ensure a smooth reintegration into society once their sentence is spent. And rehab, a familiar abbreviation, is commonly used to refer to processes of treatment that addicts undergo, for example, a detoxification process from drugs, alcohol, destructive behaviours, and so on. In criminological research, work has begun to expand the sense and use of rehabilitation in attempts to reconfigure its reach beyond the criminal justice system or in its narrower medical uses to engage issues of public health and explore wider applications to getting people into the outdoors. In particular, recent studies by including Wendy Masterton in criminology at Stirling here, critically examine the role of green space and the natural world to address multiple issues and encourage health and well-being as a more general rehabilitative process. Masterton again also found that in green space programs, the implication of living well as a more general aim provided opportunities and space to reflect feeling of purpose, as well as development of relationship with others through shared experiences. In other words, the evidence overwhelmingly points to several benefits of just being in the natural environment, and in particular in the shared experiences of that environment. Bob was in recovery and was alive, but was not in the world, so to speak, and he was not living well. In a very straightforward sense, Paul's allusion to getting Bob back into the world was exactly about this, an intervention to give Bob opportunities for engaging in healthy activities within a social context and living well. Introducing Bob to the slow practice of fishing in the green and blue spaces of the UK's waterways helped with his heart rehabilitation, but also importantly, it gave Bob a purpose in the face of life-threatening illness, risk-intensive surgery, and the very real anxieties that accompany such events of imminent mortality. It also gave both men an opportunity to embark upon a slower, more gentle career phase, in contrast to their energetic, frenetic performances of the past. Aside from its applied and social context, it's useful to think through the philosophical and phenomenological implications of the processes involved in rehabilitation. If stripped right the way back, there is a remarkable richness to the notion of rehabilitation that can prove insightful. To habilitate, as we've seen in my previous example there, is simply to make fit for living in the world. To stretch the definition, this links to habitat, the acts and experiences of dwelling or abiding. This is because of the Latin root hab, to live, to reside, which is an element found in cohabit, habitable, habitat, habitation, inhabit, inhabitant, as well as the more actively ecological attributes of ability and of exhibition. Ultimately, to rehabilitate, therefore, is to make fit again, to restore to a former capacity or state. It therefore is intimately related to the notion of health and has a restorative aspect, but also implies fitting in some capacity, as in belonging or being with. And there is a further aspect to this notion which adds to the complexity of rehabilitation. The root of rehabilitation is also linked to the Latin habeo, to have, in addition to habere, to live. There is therefore a sense that the concept is related to the ceremonial as well as literal notion of to have and to hold, commonly evoked in wedding ritual, but in a phenomenological sense is also associated with a perceptive act of apprehending, grabbing things, of holding things, of a graspability, a tactile evocation of holding in its physical and psychological senses. So this sense of holding is literal and embodied in going fishing. The frequency at which Bob stumbles and falls, sometimes by accident, but oftentimes to provoke a laugh from Paul, has the additional effect of cueing a concern over his safety, particularly given his health situation. The sense of jeopardy or vulnerability is palpable in some of the episodes more than others, and adds a frisson to the viewing encounter. And this sense of holding is at its most literal, however, in season 2, episode 6, where Bob and Paul fish for grayling on the river Ure in Yorkshire. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's definitely in Yorkshire. So after the day's fishing, as often happens in each episode, the two retire to a nearby pub. And at the Three Horseshoes pub, they meet consultant Chris Young, the heart surgeon who performed the triple bypass procedure on Bob. And we're just going to have a look at that clip now.
I've never known what happened to me. Just need his head.
There you go.
So,
Right.
you're my scrubber.
Yes.
Alright, so when I say scalpel, comes out. Bear in mind, it's bouncing around 70 times a minute. Yeah. You have to sort of bounce with it a bit. Yeah. Or
we dance.
you take the easy way out, which is you inject potassium into it. Yeah. And it goes. And is that what you did to me? And that's what you do. Yeah. Lift it up into the air, so it's sitting almost out of your chest.
Wow.
From chest. And then wearing magnifying glasses, I can stitch on the 3 bypasses. Right. How long was it out of my So it was physically stopped for 32 minutes. 32 minutes. Don't get that.
How long does the whole procedure take?
You get to the anaesthetic room at 8. Mm-hmm. You get into theatre for 9, and it finishes 12:30, 1 o'clock.
Well,
that's
a good old morning's work. Something Bob's never had to do in his life.
I feel like I'll be up again, being reborn again. Thank you so much, guys. Can I give you a hug? This is my hero. Saved my life. When I was in hospital before the operation, the nurse who looked after me said that you'll never feel the same after another human has handled your heart. right? And she said, you should hope that the person who handles it is a good man. And she said, and Chris is a good man.
Yeah, he's a good man. Yeah.
Dedicated his life to
Yeah.
saving people's lives.
Yeah.
So I just want to flag up Bob and Paul's conversation after meeting up with Dr. Chris. Bob says that the nurse who was looking after me said that you will never feel the same after another human has handled your heart. You should hope that the person who handles it is a good man. And she said, and Chris is a good man. Incredibly emotional, you know, really, really interesting, full of emotion and full of such pregnant sort of, feeling around what it must be like to go through that procedure, but also then to think about it, to talk it up, to kind of experience it with other people, right? This whole sequence is instructional in terms of the program in mobilizing imagery and symbolism of the heart. Having your heart in someone else's hands, in the most literal sense, obviously conjures up the idea of medical science as a life-saving field of knowledge and expertise, obviously, but it's much more than that. There is a risk when you bare your feelings to others, when you open yourself to another, and emotionally you leave your heart in their hands. There is a sense of humanistic alchemy here because the symbolism of this most intimate act, actualized in physical form in the operating theatre, acts as a metonym for the entire programme. And most moments of genuine emotional discussion between Bob and Paul seem organic and spontaneously arrived at. And there's never really a sense that such emotional discussions are forced between the pair. However, it shouldn't be denied that these moments occur through the mediation of activity. They come easily around the rituals of food preparation and mealtimes, for example, where Bob reciprocates Paul's fishing lessons through his own guidance on cookery. And they both reflect on the day's events. Crucially, though, these are acts of warm reciprocation, constitutive of empathy and mutual respect. Paul's act of taking Bob out fishing was an act of nurture and care in Bob's time of need. And Bob's acts of cooking and tomfoolery are his towards Paul. There are words of affection, yes, but there are also affectionate acts. And one might go as far as to say that Bob's heart was in Chris Young's hands during the procedure, and now it is in Paul's. And Bob's precarious attempts to provoke laughter in Paul through his jokes, meanderings, and pratfalls is also an exhibition of his affection. It's an attempt to reciprocate heartfelt love. And that's as far as I've got. Thank you for coming along. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful, Greg. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions, comments to Greg's lecture? We have a few minutes before we have our reception. Maria?
Thank you for that, Greg. When you were talking about the more general kind of slow movement, that sort of in which slow TV can be situated, I mean, I guess from many perspectives, you could say that that sort of slowing down is intimately related to the idea of degrowth, or like moving away from, growth as an economic driver and system. How would that look like in television, do you think?
Really good question, right? So I think this kind of example, this is just one of a few examples that I'm looking at. The concentration is on the relationship, not just between people, but between people that kind of operate in an environment that they ultimately respect and they love. And they're not looking for resources. They're not looking to extract anything from it. And if you think about the textual strategies that are at work in this kind of television, it's not intrusive. It's not passive by any stretch of the imagination, but it doesn't seek to extract anything from the environment or from the subjects and the objects that it's viewing. what it's doing is it's allowing that space for us to kind of contemplate. And I think that move away from extractivism is a really important step that this kind of programming makes. The other examples I'm really interested in, the detectorists, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Genius of television, Mackenzie Crook, also makes Wurzel Gummidge, which is a beautiful show. And I wanted to show a little bit of Wurzel Gummidge, but we haven't got time to cover everything. But that's a really good example of that sort of that emphasis of the non-human and that non-intrusiveness and that non-extraction kind of mindset. So I think that's really the kind of the framework that I want to kind of think about, is moving away from extractivism and towards something that's a little bit more. It can be very active and it can be very kind of out in the world, but it's sort of it has a real respect for the non-human.
Quite a few hands going up. I think Melissa was first, and then over to you, and then David. Sorry, Melissa.
Sorry. I like that you traced it from the kind of Norwegian slow TV movement all the way to here, because all the kind of concepts you're mentioning here about coming together and health and good times and slowness and connection with nature reminds me a lot of those kind of Danish Norwegian concepts of coziness. I wonder if that is a good term to bring in here as well, because I also see this coming out in a lot of younger generations as well, being attracted to this idea of coziness and the way that they are kind of experiencing anti-extractionism and deep growth and kind of aesthetically displaying that in things like TikTok and feeding into the ways that they kind of come together around these same sentiments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's really important. I mean, so it goes beyond the slanket and the onesie, but so the idea of being at home, staying in, but sort of connected with your friends. So having Netflix and those kinds of mutual viewing parties. Where people kind of they're watching things together, but they're not in the same room. And then they talk up about it afterwards. They exchange ideas and kind of. It becomes a whole experience, but it's one where you're seeking solitude but not loneliness, and that's really quite key. I think you can be very cozy and alone, and that feeling of solitude that comes along with that sometimes can be quite attractive and quite desirable. And I think a lot of people are seeking that. They're seeking the quiet life, so quiet and slow. And I think those things are really important. I don't know if that kind of goes somewhere to addressing that, but I think that there's certainly a kind of move towards this idea of not having to always be out there and throwing yourself out there and selling yourself and the hard sell. We don't need to do that. He says, wearing a maroon gown with a cream flash. But that's I think that is definitely the case. There is a sort of tide that's turning somehow.
There was a question.
Thanks, Greg. That was really, really interesting. I wanted to pick up on the idea of the restorative environment literature that you started with, and then this example, and talk about the role of the editor in place of the designer, and how an editor is sort of doing the designer's task in this scenario where there is a choice that is being made, which is almost the opposite of interactive television, which is that you're taking off the cognitive load from the viewer.
Yeah.
And how do you think that translates from environmental design, that kind of the removal of choice in all of this, and how it might connect?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more actually, because that's going to have some ongoing implications in terms of my final arguments around this work. But so taking away right. So the reason for having Deleuze up there in the first place on the screen was to kind of think about that contradiction, the paradox of choice and limitation or control. There is always that tension that's going on. We don't always actively seek control. We don't always actively seek agency, of course. There can be a passivity that's actually quite agential and quite kind of deliberate and intentional, right? So I think that's part of it, is that you don't actually need to be interacting all the time. Television is naturally a sort of interactive medium in that it allows that sort of space to kind of share with the screen, but also share within the room as well. So it doesn't need to always have those elements, those added elements. I think a lot of the time when television programs add those elements, they add competition, or they add, an app, or they, that second screen. This then becomes something it's quite normalised now, but it's not necessary. It's additive. It's something that's additional too. The best of the television programs that do this really, seek to integrate that and really seek a genuine sort of interactivity and reciprocation. But they're very few and far between. I think most of it is just you can download the app. Don't forget to ask permission to the bill payer and all that stuff, right? So in answer to your question, I think it's really difficult then to kind of bring some of that thinking into thinking about this kind of environmentally friendly television. But slow television where you're kind of looking at something that on the surface of it actually isn't interactive at all. What I find actually when I'm viewing something like Words and Gummidge or Bob and Paul is that it's profoundly engaging. In fact, I'm really in there, and I'm kind of looking for the incidental details. As a natural sort of cinephile, I'm kind of looking for the leaves that are floating in the wind, or I'm looking for Ted the dog. I haven't mentioned yet, but Ted the dog is the star of the show. Just wandering around, and they're doing silly impressions, voices of him. And those kinds of interactions between environment and character, and then the formal aspects of that presentation, I think those are the ways in which we can start kind of thinking about interactivity a little bit more. And of course, the role of the viewer in that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way I would answer it.
David?
Thanks for that, Greg. Great talk. My question maybe comes back to Deleuze a little bit as well, predictably. Deleuze says the freeway is a way of manufacturing control, which is not discipline, so you don't really notice it, and you've touched on passivity and activity within that. My question would be something along the lines of, well, fishing is clearly a discipline, you need to learn it, part of attention in the show is Bob not knowing it, being sort of like a city boy growing up from a different class. So class is an element there. And they go out into this beautiful landscape, it's almost deserted, and it's them, and it's nature, and it's, to me, that's sort of beautiful. But the last thing the show wants to do is get everyone from the city going down and doing this in rivers and learning the skill and emptying them of fish and so on. So is it a case of we're watching celebrities do something so we don't have to?
Right.
In that sense, it's part of the infrastructure to stop me going out and enjoying nature. I just passively enjoy it through them.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that are going on there, I think. This might be the most sustainable television programming in terms of, kind of natural tourism, because it stops us going, but it doesn't necessarily stop us going out there. I think, one of the things that something like this does is that it brings the environment in, and for many people, of course, they can't get out there. They don't have access to these spaces. They don't have, there's no infrastructure or transport to get them out there. But also, it's the thing that stops them is, oh, that's not for me. I don't go rambling about in the countryside. I hang around in shopping malls. That's what I do every Saturday. That kind of thing. So, and on the surface of that, I might sound terribly classist and things like that, but it's not actually. It's it's genuine that people sometimes they get wrapped up in their own lives so much that they don't really take a look outside. They don't take a look at the leaves that are blowing in the wind and so on, right? So that's one aspect, I think. The other aspect then is, so we're watching celebrities do this. It kind of opens up a kind of vista on the world that perhaps we're not used to or we're not aware of. So there's a sort of educational aspect. It's the BBC anyway, but there is a sort of educational aspect to this, an awareness building aspect to this that I think is really quite important. But again, as with Annika's question, I think there's some things in there that I really need to kind of have a little bit more of a think about. But hopefully that's sort of where you're at anyway.
Great. We are just a little bit over time, so I'm sorry about that. We're going to go to have drinks reception, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities to talk to Greg and to ask him and give him comments. Thank you very much. Is there?
I'm just aware that there are people watching from home. So
From home.
just maybe this is our interactive TV moment.
Yeah, it is. There you go.
Yeah. My comment is light-hearted. I wanted to know whether Greg would like to swap a pair of roller skates for a game of Kerplunk. Who's got the roller skates and who has Kerplunk? That's what I would like to know.
We can share them.
Excellent. Yeah, we can have one roller skate each, and then I can have the red Kerplunk things, and you can have the yellow ones. Okay.
We
brilliant.
can rehabilitate the superstore as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Professor Greg Singh, for showing us what love, health, environment have to do with television and why these are serious problems of the heart. So, thank you very much for a very inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
And please do join us for drinks reception, and feel free to ask Greg additional questions or have comments. So thank you so much for coming. I think he's just outside, isn't it, in Crush Hall?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much.